Welcome back, AP European History students. Today we talk about one of my favorite topics, the French Revolution. And the reason why is that the French Revolution is really this watershed moment in history where everything we've been studying about, the absolutist kings, the Enlightenment, ideas of rights and fairness all come to a head. And at this point, forget everything you've learned because it gets pretty crazy. This is a story of basically a king taking advantage of his people, mismanaging the situation, a revolution for rights, and then a terror that ensues. In fact, this rocked the Western world, and people really wondered, where do we go from here? So let's jump into it. Economic system of mercantilism to build up the wealth of the country. And it led to a bunch of mercantile wars and really a defunding of France altogether. In fact, France lost in the 7 Years' War and in the French-Indian War, and that led to a massive debt within France. Well, it didn't stop with that, because right after that, Louis XVI thought, hey, let's help out those Americans during their American Revolution. And that was great for us, but for France, it just meant that they were piling on more and more debt when it came to war. Then on top of all that, they decided to lower taxes on the rich. And what the rich would do is they would just lend money back to the government with all the money they had at higher interest rates. And then the people who got taxed were the commoners. So the problem just kept piling up for the French at this point, and that led to the boiling point. So you might be thinking right now, well, wait a second, I get that there were a lot of problems, but other countries had problems too. So why didn't the political situation just solve the problem? In fact, they had a parliament. It was called the Estates General. Why didn't they just solve the problem? Well, the reason why they couldn't solve the problem was because of the structure of the Estates General. The Estates General was made up of 3 different estates. The Estates General had 3 estates. The first one was the clergy. They only made up 1% of the population, but they owned 10% of the land. Then there are the aristocrats. They make up the second estate. They had 2% of the country, but they owned 30% of the land. And then you had the vast majority of people on the third estate, the commoners. The commoners made up 90% of the people, but only owned 35% of the land. Keep in mind, too, when I say commoners, I mean middle class. I don't even mean the poor within France at that time period. Now, here's the thing that really sucked. The way they did their voting was not based upon the population. It was based upon each estate having a vote. The first estate had a vote, the second and the third. Well, you can imagine the clergy and the aristocrats, well, they bonded together all the time. They just outvoted the commoners every single time. Then in the midst of all of this, there was a huge crisis that took place. The crisis that took place was a bread shortage. It took place in the 1780s. Now, King Louis XVI thought he could solve the problem. The way he did that was to lower regulations, which might sound good, right? Keep up competition. But landholders held most of the land in a concentrated amount. Plus, on top of that, King Louis was exporting grains out of the country. So that just caused prices to skyrocket. And now you had even more starvation. Now you really set the stage for a revolution. Well, as you can imagine, commoners, middle class, had had it up to here. And at that point, they decided to leave the Estates General. In fact, the story goes they left and they went out to a room in the Parliament. It was the tennis court room, in which they took the tennis court oath and they decided to create what was called the Declaration on the Rights of Man. Inside of this, they said that no longer was the Catholic Church going to have its own separate privileges. Their land would be taken away and given to the state. From here on out, they were going to make sure that voting would be done proportionally by the population. And they were going to try and make sure that the king wouldn't have as much power as he did. They decided to revert to a constitutional monarchy. Now, in the midst of all of this, Marie Antoinette, King Louis XVI, they were living a pretty lavish lifestyle. And that led to a massive march on the Versailles Palace by women called the Women's March, in which they hunted down Marie Antoinette, and she was scared for her life. But they basically just put King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette under imprisonment at that point. And they decided to turn the country into a constitutional monarchy, and they passed a constitution that established that. This was the liberal phase of the revolution. So what got this revolution to turn so radical so quickly? Well, King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette decided that they were going to try and flee from France. And in doing so, too, they called to the surrounding kingdoms, especially Austria and Prussia, to invade into France and to retake it and give it back to the monarchy. Well, you can imagine they got caught, and at that point they were seen as traitors, so they were eventually executed. Their heads were cut off. And at that point, they turned from a liberal revolution into a much more radical revolution. Robespierre rides to the top of this time period where he calls for a reign of terror, a guillotine that would be used to behead all the nobles and anybody who had aligned with them in order to try to be a method. The reign of terror was a method to get rid of those who were of the upper class, who were trying to stop the revolution from creating overall equality. He led a group of people called the Sans-Culottes. The Sans-Culottes was led by a number of people, including Robespierre, including a man named Georges Danton, and also Jean-Paul Moreau. They basically made the argument that the aristocracy had sold them out, and it was time to use the reign of terror in order to create a truly equal society. Now, you might think that was the worst part of it. It really wasn't. The worst part was actually what took place in the French rural areas. Originally, they had wanted more of a revolution to try and change the country. But most people who lived in the rural areas were traditional Catholics. And when they saw the radical turn, especially the de-Christianization of France, well, at that point they turned against it. And out came the French armies, and the French armies used cannons to literally blow people away who were inside of the French villages. It was at that point when things turned towards this radical phase, and as it turned towards the radical phase, Robespierre himself got caught up in it. Robespierre was eventually accused of being a traitor for some of his ideas, and he himself was guillotined and beheaded. The radical phase came to an end when Napoleon Bonaparte said that he would come in and he would restore order to a country that had become completely disordered because of this radical phase. Well, a moderate group called the Girondists tried to moderate the revolution. They even created a 5-man directory to remove the radical leaders from power. But after several years, this did not work. And along came General Napoleon Bonaparte, who said, "Hey, look, just give me a few powers here. This is an emergency. Don't worry, I'll give them back." Of course, he never did. He became emperor, and at that point took over and began to expand France's power. Now, actually, Napoleon did a lot more than you might think to spread the Enlightenment. As he went from place to place, he called for the rights for voting. He called for an expansion of education, something called the lycées for young boys. He called for more of a separation of church and state. He called for the ability for more people to own property. But at the same time, he took away people's free speech rights. He conquered different countries. He established a dictatorship. And so in the end, as Napoleon expanded further and further out, he was seen as more and more of a threat. Now, he eventually created something called the Continental System. The Continental System allowed him to control most of Europe, but to blockade the one country that got in his way, which was Great Britain. Then he made his big mistake. Napoleon decided he wanted to conquer Russia. He went deep into the Russian territory, but Russian generals had an idea about how to beat him. They just burned everything to the ground. And when he got far enough into Moscow, where everything was burnt to the ground, it was so cold, Napoleon could not keep up his supply lines. At that point, as he came back to France, his men just starved to death, or they were picked off by the Russian army. He was eventually captured, and he was sent out of France. He was exiled. He would spend the next year at the island of Elba. But he came back in the hopes that he could reunite France. And he tried one more attack at the Battle of Waterloo, where he failed again. And after that, that was it. He was exiled, and he was never heard from again. Now, the big problem at the end of all of this, of course, is what the French Revolution means for all of Europe. The French Revolution had taken down the monarchy, but it had demonstrated without order, without some kind of basic foundation, things could turn so violent. And from there on out, European politics was really going to take a change. Conservatives called for long-term order through the monarchy. Liberals called for some type of constitutional monarchy. And radicals still made the claim that society could be turned much more to a much more equal and humanizing place. So we're going to continue the story and see where all of this goes. See you in class.